I feel like we're talking about censors in three different kind of ways. I think we're talking about censors in like the actual like government, which is I think the traditional way in which people think of censorship, and we have worried about censorship in a world of free speech. In that model, that was a dyadic model. You had the government on the one hand, and you had the people on the other, and the press, kind of. The main concern, and one of the main concerns of the First Amendment, was to keep like the boot of the state off the neck of like the people, right? So that you could have expression and have these ideas out there. And that's not the world we live in anymore, because now we can root around government censorship for the most part through these third-party platforms and the internet, right? But then they themselves are censoring us, because they are deciding what stays up on the platform and what comes down. And they can, and one of the things that is happening right now are things like in Europe with Right to be Forgotten, there are just like these, or with, I was just mentioning to Corey, Pacer, which are like, how you decide to find the documents, how you decide to store them, the paywalls you put them behind, those all become like shadow bans. There's all of these various types of creative ways that people have started to find in order, what is or is not in your news feed. And an interesting thing that reminds me of is it is somewhat like, as was mentioned before, kind of like, is the press censorship? The press decides what we're going to talk about and what we're going to be thinking about and what we're made aware of and what we're not. They censor, you could call that a type of censorship. So too could you call like a librarian a type of censor. They decide what books are good enough to stay in a library and what are worthy of like being in a library and being talked about. And everything else just kind of like gets like washed into oblivion. And so I think that this is kind of this interesting theme that keeps coming up, but they do seem to be distinct ideas between kind of a government FOIA redaction, right? And the idea of an expert, an elitist expert that we trust to curate for us as a society.
I think it's worth reiterating something I said last week, this idea of John Gilmore's, that the reason you see early technology adoption among fringe groups is not that there's something especially like mimeograph adjacent about being a racist, but that if you pay a high cost to communicate using the channels that everybody else gets to use, then the additional cost of figuring out how to use a mimeograph machine might actually be lower than the cost of evading postal interception or the risk of being prosecuted for sending unlawful materials by mail or any other costs, which is why pornography is a technology adopter, and also racists, and also people who have revolutionary, radical, left-wing views and lots of other views are just more apt to take this stuff on.
Well, and you mean cost both in the sense of money, but also in the sense of your own time and effort.
Yeah.
How much effort you have put into learning the new technology versus how much more effective it is when you risk jail time or censure or the destruction of your materials when you're using the well-established technology.
And one gloss that occurs to me is that it may be that since if you have a heterodox view and you have the aptitude for adopting a new technology, your views spread further, that maybe there is a selection function in the early years of a new technology where the most successful racists are the ones who are technologically adept or have the capacity to develop technological ability, and people who, for whatever reason, just can't muster any kind of, can't conceptualize of how, say, a BBS might work, will never find themselves on LibertyNet. And so maybe there is, in that sense, there's early adopters and heterodox views, but the causal error goes the other way. It's a selection function.
I think that's true in some ways, but one thing to think about is that the movement that I study is using sort of a century of opportunistic strategy taken from earlier versions of the KKK, in which the idea has always been to figure out to use whatever is available for their own ends. And there's a lot of reasons for that. It has to do with the way that people interpret social threats as very dire and apocalyptic, right? So for people that I study, immigration isn't just about diluting some ideal, right? They experience that as like the end of the race is coming because, right? So, or at least they say they do. So one of the things that they're doing in this time period is using strategies that are available to them, the same way that we could think about the Klan in the 1920s as sort of classically anti-Black in the South, but it's also anti-Mexican on the US-Mexico border, anti-labor in the Pacific Northwest where there's a lot of unions, anti-immigrant in the Northeast where there are a lot of immigrants, right? That's the way the Klan has kind of always worked in the 20th century forward. But also because they have this sense of apocalyptic fear, I think there's actually an impetus to work together to distribute the technology. So there's one Klan leader who actually goes around in the 80s teaching, well, first of all, there is a terror group that robs armored cars and successfully nets millions of dollars from illegal activities, including that and counterfeiting. They distribute that money so that everybody can buy an Apple mini computer, which is not mini at that time, maxi computer. And this guy goes around the country teaching them how to get on LibertyNet. So there's a reason sort of, the way the ideology is constructed is pushing people together also too, anyway. But so you get the documents back through the Freedom of Information request from, say, the FBI or the Marshal Service, and they're redacted, right, which is part of the law. Redacted meaning they take black marker and they black out all of the personal information. But this is a very imperfect technology also. The old ones, when it was done by hand, sometimes if you hold it to the light, you can still read it. Good for me, bad for the law, I suppose. And the new ones are a little box made by like Adobe Writer. So it's much more thorough, but it's still done by people. So there's huge amounts of human error in the redaction process. I've gotten social security numbers. I've gotten people's fingerprints. I've gotten all kinds of things like they won't list the person, but they'll say like, this guy was 120 pounds and was 5'8". And I'm like, I know who that is. Like I don't know. Sometimes they give you like enough defining detail that you can figure it out. And sometimes the document adjacent will list the name so that you can make inferences. So it's all super imperfect.
And in the early history of redaction, digital redaction, a lot of it was either drawing black boxes on Word documents that retain in the document the full text. So there would just be a bitmap of a black box, or the same with PDFs, where they would do this as well, and you could see it. Sometimes we get Word docs that were had the whole revision history, including things like we get legislative documents that would show that they were authored by lobbyists. If you looked in the metadata for the Word doc, and you could see that this copyright law had literally been written by Motion Picture Association of America staffer, and then introduced by Orrin Hatch. There's a correlate to this in the early German debate over censoring child pornography and images of the sexual abuse of children using a national firewall in Germany, which is one of the first Western countries to put up a national firewall. And survivors of sexual abuse in Germany, or at least a subset of them, argued against it because they argued that there was an out of sight, out of mind problem. They said, Germans are leaving Germany to go to Thailand to abuse children. And if we block those images, then no one in Germany will take an interest in prosecuting those Germans who do it. And that it's only and that people will evade the blocks. The people who are dedicated to looking at the abuse of children will find ways to get around the blocks. What won't happen is that we won't have the kind of public realization that our countrymen are engaged in this bad conduct. And where that kind of plays out today is there's this tension between, do we censor extremism on online platforms, or do the police use it as a base for surveilling and disrupting activities that they want to undermine? And this is the great fight that I think within security services they have, and between security services and online platforms.
But when we did Australia, New Zealand, where there are fewer of these big sensational cases to look at, both because there isn't quite an equivalent of our American Library Association Office of Intellectual Freedom, which does big publicity tracking on classroom stuff, but also just because it's a smaller population, so there are fewer cases. They had to reach much more broadly, and we had a lot of mundane things, or things that are far from what you would think of as the political face of censorship. So like nudist colony newsletters about nudism and whether in nature man should wear no clothes. And we have a wonderful New Zealander nudist magazine which was running an article about, is it immoral for mankind to go to space because in space you have to wear clothes because there's vacuum and you'll die. And since humans can never be naked in space, does that mean we shouldn't go to space? And this is so far from anyone's political spectrum. Yeah, and lots of the materials were like that from Australia and New Zealand, not because those materials don't get targeted in the US, but because we have a very specific hero-villain narrative of what we look for in the history of censorship, which makes us much less likely to notice the mundane cases of censoring a exhibit catalog of a mediocre art exhibit in which 1 out of 300 pieces had a penis in it. And so it got targeted for censorship, but none of the people involved are particularly famous, or a photo book of sexy sailors that got censored in New Zealand. And all of these materials, which are just much less in alignment with a particular framing of the heroic free speech advocate or the heroic author who is advancing a liberal agenda, and much more just all kinds of things get censored for all kinds of reasons in these spaces.